I'm good with most things. I can handle speed up to a point. I mean, if you go blazingly fast and I miss something, I can relay it. I like you guys to tell me at the end why you think you won the round and give me a mechanism for weighing it so I don't have to figure it out myself. But, oh, and I like your evidence to say what you say your evidence says. Besides that, good.
Yeah, I think my ballot's really easy to win. Just literally like be as explicit as possible about like what arguments are important in the round, like warrant them, give me your reasons like why they're important, and when your weighing mechanisms conflict, like tell me why your weighing mechanism should be preferred over your opponent's weighing mechanism.
I really, really hate it if you go for all the arguments in the round. So you should probably pick 2, 3 at most. I also really like it when you clearly extend and explain what a warrant is for your argument, which does not mean an author says it so, but explains why the author found it to be true. With that said, I agree with the impact stuff, and if you want me to read evidence, you need to get up there and say, hey, call this card, otherwise I will not call it. And you need to tell me why I'm calling it, otherwise I'll call it and then hand it right back, because I don't know what I'm looking for.
We negate today's topic. Resolve, committing United States ground combat troops to fight ISIL is in the best interest of the United States. The standard of today's debate round is going to be long-term stability. Contention 1 is anti-American sentiment. Al-Abadi, the Iraqi Prime Minister, has explicitly said that no foreign combat troops will be allowed in Iraq. According to Robert Pate from the Washington Post, sending in ground troops and consciously violating the will of the Iraqi government will cause the United States to be seen as an occupying force. Because the United States interventions give the impression of imposing Western ideas and culture and changing Muslim culture, foreign policy finds that interventions increase anti-American sentiment. There are 2 impacts. The first is increasing terrorism. Robert Pate found a 6-fold increase in global suicide terrorism when the United States entered a foreign country. Altogether, the London School of Economics finds that an increase in military personnel in a foreign country increases anti-American terrorism by 24%. The second impact is delegitimizing the Iraqi government. John Kerry explains that if we intervene on behalf of the Iraqi security force and mediate every conflict for them, they will never gain the experience and ability to put down insurgencies on their own. It is not in the interest of the United States to have to come back every time there is a problem in the region. We need to create a self-sustaining Iraq. Contention 2, United States leadership creates complacent governments. Rebecca Kaplan from CBS News explains that while the Muslim coalition wants to see ISIL defeated, it doesn't have the political or military motivation to use combat troops or lead the attack against ISIS. As a result, Robert Mary from the National Interest explained that committing United States combat troops relieves regional countries of the responsibility for protecting themselves from ISIS and smaller conflicts in the region. He argues that United States policy should encourage the nations of the Middle East to develop their own strategies to defend and advance their own interests, not rush to assume that the United States will solve the problem. There are 2 impacts. The first is long-term instability in the Middle East. Mary furthers that ISIS poses a threat to both Jordan and Turkey. However, the tendency of the United States to intervene in far-off conflicts allows these countries to ignore the true threat of ISIS and expect the United States to solve all problems. Without Muslim leadership in this fight, Mary writes that the existing political geography of the Arab world faces erosion and ultimate collapse because governments can't fulfill the fundamental obligation of protecting themselves. Bartowski finds that the risk of civil war recurring is 40% in the 10 years after military intervention, and as a result, the RAND Corporation finds that the risk of re-intervention in a region increases by as much as 50% with each United States military intervention. The second impact is increasing the threat to United States soil. As a result, Ramsey Mardini from the Washington Post reveals that Obama's restraint in the use of military power in recent years has helped keep the Islamic State's focus regional. But with the prospect of United States military invasion in Iraq, ISIL is now changing its focus to attacking the United States. Contention 3 is political warfare. According to Marcij Bartowski, ISIS is dependent on the support of the communities it governs. The 30,000 ISIL fighters would be no match if the 6 million people that ISIS governs decided to unite and resist. Bartowski explains that ISIL's legitimacy depends on the ideas that they spread by false propaganda that shows ISIL providing proper living standards, such as restoring electricity and providing healthcare services. The idea of political warfare is to turn the allegiance of the people away from ISIS. In this case, political warfare would be spreading information on the true conditions that exist in ISIS-controlled lands, or providing the services to Muslims that ISIS cannot, which is like healthcare, water, and food, which would turn the allegiance of the people away from ISIS and towards the United States. There are 2 impacts. The first is defeating ISIS. Maria Stephen from MIT finds that political warfare against militant groups is successful 53% of the time, whereas the RAND Corporation finds that military force is only effective in 7% of cases. Committing ground combat troops is not in the United States' best interest if a different option is more effective and better. The second impact is long-term stability for Iraq. Stephen furthers that political warfare shifts the allegiance of militants. Political warfare induces defections to the government side 52% of the time. Altogether, Bartowski concludes that nonviolent organizing is 3 times shorter and 10 times more likely to set up a stable democracy than using ground troops. And for those reasons, please vote nay.
At some point before my rebuttal, I see a 6-fold increase in suicide terrorism.
Without U.S. combat troops deployed to Iraq or Syria, including joint terminal attack controllers, special operations forces who move into deep enemy territory to help calm airstrikes, combating ISIS is significantly more difficult. Second, interrogation. Bureau of Foreign Affairs writes that, quote, while aircraft can drop bombs and kill people, only commandos can capture and interrogate high-level terrorists, gathering intelligence that has the potential to wipe out an entire enemy network. Brennan and Brand finds that, quote, the U.S. will be unable to defeat ISIS without employment of elite U.S. counterterrorism forces to target key ISIS leaders in Iraq and Syria. Third, building positive impressions. Miller of Ceylon explains that, quote, the people under ISIS's power are suffering traumas that will rebound for generations to come. And Byman of the Brookings Institute explained that ISIS is more outwardly oppressive and violent than Al-Qaeda ever was. The Center for Research on Globalization corroborates that worldwide, quote, the most explicit condemnation of ISIS came from the Secretary General for the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the group representing 57 countries and 1.4 billion Muslims. Appealing to the universal hate of ISIS shifts popular support for the United States, giving us more access to intelligence and resources. This is why Choi of the University of Illinois writes that, quote, the likelihood of terrorism decreases when the U.S. uses its armed forces exclusively to fight terrorists. Destroying ISIS is crucial. Kagan of the Institute for the Study of War explains that, quote, ISIS will embolden other violent non-state actors to challenge weak state security across the Middle East and North Africa. This is the most dangerous and likely scenario. She concludes that, quote, it is worth accepting the risk of troops to avoid this. Contention 2 is multilateralism. Troops catalyze further multilateral action against ISIS in 3 different ways. First, the vacuum effect. Cosmic of Harvard writes that, quote, military action demonstrates strong U.S. resolve to limit terrorism, and this strong resolve creates a vacuum effect that draws other nations into the cooperative effort out of desire to advance their status and curry favor with the U.S. and the international community. Second, political capital. Indeed, Ahmed at the Huffington Post writes that, quote, for the Gulf states in the coalition, this is an opportunity to bolster their reputations as leaders in the region and allies internationally. The current partners will also benefit if they use their campaign to show their constituencies that they are undermining the rule of Assad. Third, tension reduction. Etzioni of George Washington University writes that, quote, multilateral action is blocked by a vicious circle. Interblock cooperation is not forthcoming unless tension is reduced, but tension cannot be reduced until a higher degree of cooperation is attained. Hence, unilateral action opens the way to multilateral action. Especially considering the violent history of the region, trust is too low for any country to take the first step and risk being left alone to deal with the repercussions. Thus, Kagan of the Institute for the Study of War confirms that right now, quote, an alliance can only be effective in support of a strategy that includes a real American commitment, including forces on the ground. And Wong of the Hill notes that, quote, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab nations are ready to send ground forces into Iraq and Syria as soon as U.S. forces join them. The impact is threefold. First, military strength. Fighting ISIS requires expanding military budgets, and by generating stronger security apparatuses, Sandler of UT Dallas writes as the country increases, quote, military spending by 1%, the expected number of attacks fell by 23%. General Dempsey writes that, quote, building partner capacity has long been a hallmark of American defense policy, making our partners more effective and improving our collective ability to respond to real-world crises, because regional players also almost always understand their neighborhood security challenges better than we do. Second, deterrence. Metz and Strategic Studies Institute explains the criteria for deterring modern security threats as such that, quote, America's potential allies must believe that the U.S. can sustain military operations for as long as possible without losing national will or public support. There are many ways to do this beyond the traditional use of bombers, drones, and missiles, and one would be having the ability to surge support for local allies. And third, less anti-American sentiment. Peters of Creighton University finds that making the U.S. seem like more of a partner rather than an imperialist, quote, wide multilateralism is often a good measure to use in more volatile regions to buffer anti-U.S. sentiment, even though the U.S. may be largely in charge of the operation. Thus we affirm. Thank you. Are you ready for crossfire?
Yeah. you say in your first argument that you see a decrease in terrorism when the United States uses weapons to specifically kill terrorists,
Yeah,
right?
Troy looks specifically at intervention.
Alright,
Yeah.
so how can you guarantee that we don't kill any civilians?
Wait, I mean, like, collateral damage always, like, happens.
Alright,
I mean,
so then
like,
wouldn't that mean that argument, so wouldn't that mean that,
it was, like,
alright,
civilian casualties,
so if we,
like, in the long run,
so,
because it decreases terrorism.
so if we kill some terrorists, that means we're not specifically killing, or if we kill some civilians, that means we're not specifically killing terrorists. So doesn't that piece of evidence mean nothing in the
How does that preclude us from the evidence? I'm sure that some of the operations Troy looked at had some civilian casualties, but what he finds that in the big picture, when you go against terrorists specifically in interventions, you decrease terrorism.
Alright, but the quote you read said if you kill only terrorists, anti-American,
Wait, no, like if you wanted, like the category that he refers to it as is anti-terrorist like intervention. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, sure. So you talk about like military dependency, I guess, in your second contention, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree that like the militaries of the Middle East are like pretty weak right now? Like they are like dependent on other countries?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about that, right? In your second argument, you talk about how we can build the capacity of these militaries up. Why do we need ground combat
Wait,
forces?
sorry,
to do that?
can I continue my question? Yeah, so like if they're not like if the US isn't in the region, like don't they become dependent on like other countries in the region?
No.
Why?
Like, who are they going to become
Like you
dependent on?
just said that like they were like in the status quo, these militaries within the region are extremely weak and are dependent on other countries.
They're dependent
So
on the
if
United
US wasn't,
States.
why are they the US specifically?
Because the United States is the country that goes in every
But
5
in
years
this-
to kill
okay, but
terrorists.
in the status quo, these militaries are very weak, right? They're not self-sustaining.
That's exactly what we're telling you, right?
Okay,
We
cool.
went into Iraq, we went into Afghanistan, that's why they're dependent.
But if the US isn't there, won't they become dependent on other countries?
You guys tell us you can build up their capacity without
Well,
ground
actually,
combat.
yeah, they are becoming dependent on other countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia.
Alright, so let's talk about Iran really quickly.
Yeah, cool.
So, the Washington Post found yesterday that Assad's regime is falling at a faster rate than it has ever been falling before. And doesn't that mean that Iran's influence is decreasing in the region because Assad is like the primary factor of Iranian
What does it have
hegemony?
like anything to do with like our advocacy?
Like, you guys are talking about how if the United States leaves, other countries are going to come in and exert their hegemony, right?
We're also talking about our like allies in the region, like
Alright,
Jordan
okay,
and
so
Saudi Arabia.
really
because they
quickly,
wouldn't
what is this other factor that increases their hegemony?
Wait, what do you mean?
Like you said, if the United States leaves, don't they become dependent on other countries? What other
Yes.
country are you talking about?
If you Tim will read Fisher of the Daily Beast and Republic, which essentially says when the US isn't in the region, most of these countries become dependent on either Iran or Saudi Arabia. And
Alright,
what happens is these
on to
countries
the
use
response
these
to
like
that.
dependent countries to like fight proxy wars. But can I ask you a question?
Go for it.
So like when you come in your third contention when you talk about like political warfare, right? So like this mainly comes to like I guess like fighting propaganda, like that's mainly what you talk about.
No, it's the biggest part of political warfare is filling the void that ISIS
Why is
has,
it mutually
right?
exclusive with ground combat?
Alright, so actually, Bartashi specifically finds that we have limited funding to fight ISIS, so that we should relocate some of that funding to political warfare from your third. But second, let me finish. The more important part of exclusivity is that the purpose of political warfare is to turn the allegiance of the people away from ISIS towards the United States, but military intervention does the opposite.
Alright, so we'll take running track.
Do you guys have the sword guys?
Are you back up or not?
No, we're asking to see sword.
No, I'm talking to you. You guys have it.
I don't want to.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we keep this for the rebuttal?
Yeah. Alright, so I'm gonna. framework of today's debate. Now, you're going to look to long-term stability because that's a prerequisite for other U.S. interests in the region. Recognize that if there's no long-term stability, the United States has to continually go into the Middle East every 5 years to put down another insurgency. That's going to be the reason why you're weighing long-term stability. And with that in mind, go to the first contention about decreasing terrorism. First, they talk about airstrikes. Two responses here. First, recognize that we don't need U.S. ground combat troops. Specifically with the Iraqi security force, the problem is being solved. In fact, the Daily Mail notes that we've decapitated 17 of 43 ISIL leaders with the Iraqi security force and U.S. airstrikes. Recognize they don't show the unique benefits that U.S. ground troops would have to the Iraqi security force. But second, land. Airstrikes with the Iraqi security force have been taking back land away from ISIL. In fact, The Economist notes that ISF with U.S. airstrikes have taken away 25% of ISIL's land. Now, this is key because ISIL is a caliphate, right? It depends on how much land they control and the support of its people. Recognize that in the negative world, we're solving both of those. First, we're taking away land with airstrikes, but second, political warfare induces defections 52% of the time. Now, next, let's talk about their second point about intimidation. The main response here is that these special operations, like stuff that they're talking about, don't actually work. In fact, foreign policy notes that just a couple months ago, special operation forces work for their military objectives less than 50% of the time, and their political objectives only 6% of the time. Recognize that Barkowski finds that political solvency is the only way to stop ISIL, and the reason is because ISIL depends on their nose of dependency among their administrators and among their people. Given that special operations are not effective with political solvency, you cannot vote for them because the root of ISIL is political, not military, prefer political warfare. But third, they talk about like positive impressions, right? The first main response is that you turn this argument against them because you actually you hurt anti-American sentiment. In fact, David Kilcullen of Oxford University writes that during the initial stage of development of an extremist presence, there is usually local opposition to the terrorist group. Like right now, Sunnis don't like ISIS. But if the United States goes in, the presence of an intervening outsider causes local groups to coalesce in a fusion response. Essentially, these foreign-based interventions increase support for terrorists because ISIL paints the picture that the United States is a crusading nation against ISIL. In fact, Sonny Kundal from the New Statesman finds that if the United States goes in, they're gonna fend off long-term terrorism because there's perceived Islamophobia. Look at the evidence that Anya reads in our first contention. He finds that because Western intervention is usually seen as imperialism and perceived Islamophobia, there's long-term anti-American sentiment. Now next they talk about their impact with Kagan. Recognize that ISIL is going to be emboldened if we do military intervention. Essentially look to the fact that they get more local support, but on top of that, the regional actors in the Middle East are not able to stop ISIS because of complacency. They advocate for U.S. leadership in their second argument. Now let's go to that argument about multilateralism. First, they talk about power vacuum. Recognize that Iran is not going to fill any power vacuum because just yesterday, the Daily Mail notes that Assad's regime is falling. And this is the source of a lot of Iranian hegemony in the Middle East. And given that it's falling, without United States military intervention, Iran is not going to have a lot of hegemony. But moreover, let's look at their second point about political capital. Two responses here. First, specifically look to the fact that early this year in January, Jordan and Turkey acknowledged that ISIL has a threat to them, but they're not doing anything because they're assuming that the United States is going to come in. So even if my opponents say that these countries might want to do it, they're not going to do it because U.S. leadership, you turn this argument against them. But second, the New Statesman finds that there's too much lack of unity, too many tensions between the countries in the Middle East for them to actually form a coalition. In fact, a lot of them are fighting proxy wars against each other, and they don't have the unity to come and attack ISIL. For all those reasons, please vote for the nay.
Okay. Oliver?
Yeah.
And all your judges? Let's start on the framework. He just tries to say that long-term stability is going to be the most important thing, and we agree. But the bottom line is, it's not just the long-term stability of Iraq. You should look at the long-term stability of the entire world. And we're the only real people in the round who give you the impacts that actually extend to the entire world. On our second contention, the three impacts, which he drops in rebuttal, having a stronger military, have a stronger deterrent effect on our enemies, and having less anti-American sentiment worldwide, all benefit our security all over the globe. So they have the most impact on scope, which means we're going to be outweighing them because we're impacting long-term stability in way more places than that they are. That being said, let's move to my first contention, which is going to be about anti-American sentiment, and they say that we're going to be seen as an occupying force. My opponents don't get the context of the situation that we give you in our first contention, where we tell you that ISIS is committing human rights abuses. This isn't a typical situation where we're intervening against like a government that's supporting its people. They are brutal, and that's why we're telling you, if you look to the Center for Research on Globalization, that at one point, the leader of the organization that represents 57 countries of 1.4 billion Muslims says that they hate ISIS because of how repressive they are and what they do to Islam. That means that we only increase our anti-American, pro-American sentiment worldwide when we actually intervene. But then they talk about like these all increases in terrorism. They give you two studies, PAPE and Numeric. First of all, PAPE, like the statistic they gave you is correlation, not causation. It just says that across these years there was an increase in suicide attacks. He doesn't causally relate them back to the United States. And second of all, they give you Numeric. It says there's a 24% increase in terrorism. First of all, he admits that he can't prove a causal link because the United States is more likely to send military action into an area that had terrorism already. But second of all, he himself says that he doesn't code anything from like civil wars and interstate conflicts, which is actually more comparable to what we're looking at here. That being said, that means you can prefer Choi, who we give you in our first contention, and that he drops in rebuttal. Choi isolates for specifically anti-terrorism interventions and finds that those actually reduce the amount of terrorism, and she controls for reverse causality and finds that they're actually effective. That means that we're the only ones giving you the actual most specific evidence on how we're actually going to be winning terrorism. And then they tell you how we're going to make this government dependent on us. You can look to Smith of the Atlantic, who tells you that we made the Iraqi government like dependent on us in the last invasion, but the U.S. military went back and revised its policies because it realized that we undertrained the Iraqi security forces. That means that we aren't going to make that mistake again, and my opponents don't get the impact on this intervention. Now let's move on to a second contention about complacent governments in the region. The biggest response here is going to come from Fisher of the Daily Star that Oliver reads you in Crossfire, who tells you that dependency is mainly non-unique, because in the past, when the United States has stopped contributing anything to the region, Iran or Saudi Arabia has moved in. So the impacts of dependency are non-unique. So let's see why it's going to be better for them to be dependent on us. First of all, if Iran or Saudi Arabia takes control of them, then they could just use them as a tool in their proxy war between the Sunnis and the Shias. But second of all, having them dependent on us means that we can extract concessions from them and leverage them for the future. But then they talk about this 40% relapse rate from a military operation. That is the definition of non-unique. If it isn't us sending troops, it's just going to be the Iraqi government. It's going to have that same risk of relapse, and the statistic doesn't matter. The second impact is saying that only this will create a threat to U.S. soil. But this is non-unique. Look to Klein of WorldNet News, who tells you that right now, ISIS is planning a summer offensive of attacks that could include possible sleeper cells in the United States. And they've explicitly said in their own magazine, Dabiq, on like the second page, they say, either come fight with us or fight the United States where you are in the country. They're already inciting attacks against the United States. Now let's look to the third contention, which is political warfare. On face, this is basically a counterplan. They don't prove that negating, not sending in troops, automatically diverts all this funding towards the political warfare that they talk about. But second of all, they don't prove that it's even mutually exclusive. There's no real reason why you can do both. They just say that we should divert money out of the budgets, which one, reinforces the fact it's a counterplan, but second of all, it doesn't make any sense that like propaganda and the US military would come out of the same budget. And even if it did, we can increase deficit spending, there isn't a real trade-off. But third of all, you can turn this, because a ground presence is the only way to actually deliver the type of assistance that they talk about. Because one, we can't drop it in. It's not like we can just drop in propaganda with ISIS there. And second of all, ground troops liberating victims provides good propaganda. But this doesn't matter, because if you look to Morov of HB Magazine, he tells you that US propaganda is ineffective in the region because we're seen as hypocritical. That's going to deal with them out of their impact, because it means they can't solve. Thank you. Are you ready for crossfire?
So in response to our first contention, you say like a lot of people hate ISIS, right? They're committing human rights abuses, and therefore if we intervene, it's okay, right?
Yes.
All right. So given that the Iraqi government explicitly said he's not going to allow foreign combat troops, doesn't what you say not matter because we're violating Iraqi sovereignty?
That's very, very interesting. And let's talk about the entirety that the Iraqi PM didn't want us to intervene.
Yeah.
So what you were talking about a public statement, right?
Yeah.
So what's the Iraqi government actually said behind closed doors?
Or what did they say?
According to Shinkman of the National Interest, behind closed doors, Iraqi officials have told the United States that they want to intervene because it means that they have.
Last week when he came to
Yes.
Washington D.C.? All right, because when
Wait,
he
can
came,
I please finish my response?
All right, sure.
Because the bottom line is behind closed doors, out of the public eye, that you yourself admit is anti-American. He's actually said he wants the U.S. to intervene because he doesn't want to cooperate with
Is that
Iran.
specific to? All right, two things. First, is that specific to ground combat troops? Because he says he wants more like U.S. military advisors, U.S. military aid. That's not necessarily ground combat troops. But second, are you talking about the visit that he had to Washington D.C. last week, where he explicitly said he still didn't want ground combat?
No, we're telling you that behind closed doors is a better measure because he doesn't corrupt it by having to appease his followers. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. I just want to see that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So on our second contention, On our first warrant, you respond with like saying like power vacuums. Where do we talk about power vacuums?
Are you're tagging on your first contention?
It's the vacuum effect. The
Yeah,
vacuum effect is different from power
Right,
vacuums.
so, okay, so you guys are saying that if the United States doesn't do anything, then like Saudi Arabia or Iran is gonna gain power in Iraq.
Okay, two important things. One, I read that in rebuttal that's different from yours. Second of all, that isn't what the vacuum
Okay, so
effect is.
then what is the vacuum?
The vacuum effect is, according to Mark Cosmic of Harvard, what happens when the U.S. intervenes in a region. There are countries behind us that want to curry favor with us in the international community, so they follow suit. He gives the example of
Sure.
yeah.
So how do you know those countries are actually going to commit ground combat troops? Because the analysis that Ani tells you, or our second contention, that Jordan and Turkey acknowledge that there's a threat. They know ISIL is a threat to themselves, but they're refusing to put ground combat troops because the United States is supposedly going to do the same thing. Like they want the United
No,
States.
it's actually the exact reverse. Jordan and Saudi Arabia actually told the United States, we will send in ground combat
Yeah,
troops.
sure. So that was like this one Republican senator on like
Wait,
February
wait.
6th, right?
Wait, a Republican senator who had spoken with the ambassadors of those
Okay,
countries
so the
previous
very
to the
next
interview.
paragraph in that article says like, is Jordan ready to mobilize ground troops? And her answer was no, not yet. Your own author says that. But more importantly, the article from 2 days after that says that none of these troops in the none of these countries in the Middle East are ready to mobilize their ground
Okay, well, we
combat.
can debate Wong later, but if you don't want to look to Wong, look to Kagan. Kagan says that they will follow suit. Do you have a question for me?
Alright, yeah, sure. So in response to our second argument, you talked about like Fisher, right? How there's gonna be dependency either way.
Yes.
So why will like Saudi Arabia take over like some vacuum in Iraq if the United States doesn't do it?
Because essentially, like, there's this, there's basically a power struggle happening and a proxy war happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Like, that's what's going on in Yemen
but
right now.
wouldn't
And
you- wouldn't
what
you-
Fisher of the Daily Star says is, in the event that we aren't in the region, one of them will step in.
Alright, so we'll take right into account. Uh, 15 seconds.
How much do you have left?
10.
I've used 15.
No. 15?
I have like 15 left.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, I agree with 15. I said 15 for a second.
Oh, 15.
I had enough. You wanna give us a brief roadmap so I know where we're going?
You know, where should you start with framework or go to anti-Americanism? Alright, so let's start with framework. Now realize they concede to long-term stability. At this point, you're going to be voting negative if you realize that my opponent's advocacy makes the problem worse. Now let's start with how they actually do that. Let's talk about anti-Americanism. And to this point, they haven't responded to the Oxford analysis, which tells you that even though initially the people might be against the terrorist group, when a foreign invader comes in to try and protect them, that shifts the allegiance away from that foreign invader towards the terrorist group. Now their entire response to our first argument is that ISIS is killing people, they don't like us. That completely ignores the fact that when we go in, we change that because now we're the Crusaders, not ISIS. They dropped that. Remember, anti-Americanism increases. Now remember, by voting for the affirmative, when you increase anti-Americanism, that leads to an increase in terrorism. Now they try and indict our evidence saying it was correlatory, it wasn't actually like statistically proven to be because of the United States intervention. If you read the sentence right above, it says when the United States intervened in Afghanistan, you saw a 6-fold increase in terrorism. You don't look to that no link in response. They make terrorism does increase. Now next, let's talk about complacency. Now they try and make the argument that if the United States goes into these countries, they'll somehow follow us and then we can defeat ISIS together. That's not actually happening. Remember, their evidence is a quote from a senator who says that for some reason Jordan and Saudi Arabia are going to follow us if we attack, but that's not true. The very next paragraph says they're not ready to attack and follow us. That impact goes directly to complacency, which is our second argument. This is a huge reason you vote negative. You don't want to vote for a world where the United States has to come back into the Middle East every 3 or 4 years to solve a new insurgency. Remember, the deadliest terrorist organizations arise out of power vacuums created by the United States. They tell you that ISIS is way more deadly than Al-Qaeda. Remember, we went in, we stopped Al-Qaeda, and when we leave, that's when ISIS comes back up. So solving the problem initially doesn't mean long-term stability. You don't vote for them off of solvency because they don't show you that we create a long-term stability in the Middle East. Now remember, Jordan and Saudi Arabia aren't going to back the United States in a coalition. We have evidence to support that. Their evidence goes contrary. You don't vote for a world where American soldiers are consistently put at risk. That's against the United States interest. Next, extend the response that Anshul makes in a rebuttal speech, saying that special operation forces accomplish their political objectives less than 6% of the time. That's huge. There's no solvency. Next, remember that Assad is failing. Iran has no hegemony in the Middle East. They can't prove that this power vacuum thing is actually going to happen.
Can you take a few seconds to try?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I think I got like 26-ish. I started a little late though. Alright.
Opponent's ready?
Yeah.
You said ready. Judge is ready. Off 10 roadmap framework for the two voting issues. They dropped the weighing analysis on multilateralism. It's the most important point in the round because it's the biggest scope and magnitude because A, it acts outside of the regions like Iraq and Syria that we're talking about, and B, it deters other terrorist groups beyond Iraq and Syria. That's our first voting issue, multilateralism. So in response to our first war, the vacuum effect, essentially he talks about power vacuums. But remember, A, power vacuums have nothing to do with the vacuum effect, which means we're drawing in other countries because the U.S.'s credibility. But B, according to Gloca Political, it was the lack of U.S. troops in the area that created power vacuums in areas like Libya and Yemen. Then second of all, to our second war, political capital, they say that Jordan's not willing to do anything. Extend Wong and tells you that Jordan is going to send in troops if we come in. When they try to indict our evidence, Jordan hasn't confirmed that they're not ready, but they haven't explicitly said that they're not ready. But even if you don't buy that, extend Kagan that they never respond to. Kagan also confirms an alliance is impossible without a U.S. commitment. Then their second response is essentially that like cooperation is impossible, but that's all back with a third warrant that they completely dropped. The fact that you break cycles of tension according to Etzioni if you send in American troops. With that in mind, extend the three impacts that they never respond to. First, UT Dallas, when you create spending in the area that decreases terrorist attacks by 23%. Second, that's because you create deterrence in the entire world. This is the biggest impact on scope in today's round. And third of all, Peters, that tells you there's less anti-American sentiment because there's so many countries involved, they act as a buffer to anti-American sentiment. The second voting issue is defeating ISIS. When you look at positive impressions, you can't look to studies like Oxford in today's round because Byman says that ISIS is a unique situation in that they're more brutal and oppressive than any other group has ever been. Remember, extend CRG. 1.4 billion Muslims have condemned ISIS. I'd say that's a lot more than just local support. When you look at imperialism, that's answered back by Peters that they never respond to. Remember, it's a buffer to anti-American sentiment when you act with coalition, and they never respond to Troy. Remember, the PAVE evidence looks at areas like Iraq, but when you counter specifically for anti-terrorism interventions, not what their PAVE evidence looks at, he says, quote, he finds that there's less terrorism overall. And extend Kagan, remember, here's the cost-benefit analysis of sending in like the risk of emboldening other state actors versus the risk of sending in troops, and confirms pro. When we look at dependency, extend the Fisher analysis. Saudi Arabia and Iran are using dependent countries to fight proxy wars. We can prevent that if you go further. Thank you.
Alright, so can we have the first question?
Go for it.
So in summary, you say Kagan says that we can't do multilateralism without American troops, right?
Kagan says that they will only commit on the ground if we do it.
Okay, but why does that matter if Jordan and Saudi Arabia say they won't and they can't?
Jordan and Turkey.
Or yeah, Jordan and Turkey.
Okay, no, wait. What we're trying to say is that first of all, it's more than just Jordan and Turkey. It's about a lot of other
You
regional
guys never
allies.
prove other countries.
Sorry. No, our only the only explicit countries that said that they will is Jordan and Saudi Arabia. But all our other warrants tell you that other first of all, other countries in the region like Qatar and the UAE will do it. But second of all, even just like outside the region, US like allies, like those are the ones that anybody who wants to curry favor with the United States is gonna have a unique incentive if they're
So first, can we see that evidence about Qatar and the UAE?
Yeah,
and moreover, in
Yeah, that was the Ahmed evidence.
Alright,
They have a political
Alright, so
incentive.
in summary, you also try and extend Wong through the ink, saying that, like, in the paragraph right below that card that says Jordan won't, right?
Let's clarify what she said. She says that the Jordan troops refuse to give an answer on whether they're ready. What you're trying to portray that is that they explicitly said that they're not ready. That's completely
Okay, yeah, because that was the, like, February 8th evidence. Like, the Wong evidence was from February 6th. The The February 8th one said that Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East don't have the political or military will to actually commit to
Why
ground
not?
combat.
Okay, well, we'd like to
Because,
see
like,
that.
first of all, there's too many tensions between them.
And-
That's
Okay,
why-
that's perfect, because what the Etzioni evidence that you clean drop says is that when the US actually takes the lead, it increases trust in the region.
Okay, so why though? Like
Okay.
logically why?
Let me
If
put it this
they
way, right?
already have like deep embedded tensions between themselves, why can the United States just suddenly
This is
stop
why.
that
This
if
is
like
why.
you want to attack this
This
political
is
power?
why. So what Etzioni says is that the reason that unilateralism can pave the way for multilateralism is that when we intervene in, basically what happens is nobody trusts each other enough to cooperate.
That's
what
what
you're
just
saying, right?
initiate conflict, right?
Yeah, no.
So the United States intervenes and that sectarian conflict is like
Wait, this is the
disappears.
first time we're hearing this in the round, but like,
Yeah.
second of all, like, what we're essentially telling is like, only the United States intervening can break the fact that like tension and
Okay, why
cooperation.
though?
Basically, because
Why?
no
Just
country
explain
wants to
why
take.
first.
Wait, let me explain. No country wants to take the first step in like any kind of action because if the other people don't
Why does the
follow
United
suit.
States
I'm
have to
trying
be
to
the
explain. Because what happens is you yourself say that nobody in the region is going to take the lead because they don't trust
Right, but
anybody else.
recognize that when the United States is the one that takes the lead, they perceive it as Western culture
That's-
trying to be imposed on them,
that's
and that
not
creates
true at all.
perceived
Wait.
Islamophobia.
That's not true at all with the Peters evidence, where she explicitly says even if the U.S. is the one leading the entire like the coalition, the fact that multiple countries are involved actually
I know,
buffers
but the United
anti-American
States is the
sentiments.
leader. Now that's specifically
No, wait.
the
She
stunning
actually
thing-
says
let me
even
finish
if
my
the U.S.
answer.
is leading the operation,
Yeah,
it
it's
still
really-
makes us
Okay,
seem
but
like less
logically
than
why?
them.
Because we're showing you the warrant behind it is perceived Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Now recognize that if we try to go in and say we're going to destroy this caliphate, it's perceived as destroying like Islam, or at least part of an
No, but here's the
interpretation
thing.
of
Wait.
Islam.
Here's the thing. Like the bottom line is that when the U.S. goes in with other countries, it portrays the United States as a team player, not a random country
go
acting
into
on
it.
Oh yeah,
its
so
own.
first they wouldn't go in, like, you guys, like, there's still dispute of if they would actually go in with other countries, but second, US would be the leader, so it'll still cause Islamophobia. Alright, we have 15 seconds, so let's take the rest of that. Alright, so I was at the page. Alright, so just framework, policy/anti-Americanism, and then completeness. Alright, so first let's look at framework. Recognize we both agree long-term stability in the Middle East and globally is going to be really important. With that in mind, let's look to how they're not winning on two key issues. First is going to be anti-Americanism and solvency. Recognize if anti-Americanism exists, they don't garner any solvency because anti-terror attacks are going to occur in the long term. Now, they don't give you the warrants behind like all the evidence that they read. They say if the United States goes in, somehow there's going to be like no anti-American terrorism. We give you the warrant behind the fact that the United States is going to be the leader. Even if another coalition happens, the U.S. would be the leader, and that's going to cause perceived Islamophobia. They don't respond to the foreign policy evidence that says when the United States intervenes, and even if they're the leader, that they're going to be seen as imposing Western culture on Islam. Now that's huge because Islam can use this as propaganda because they're going to see the United States as a crusading nation. And that's really important because the Oxford analysis that I read to you says that initially there's support against the terrorist group. But when the United States goes in, that dynamic shifts against the United States and for the terrorist organization. We give you the warrants behind it. Don't let them come up here and read that warrant. But remember, the impact is global instability because it's a six-fold increase in global terrorism attacks. This is when we went into Iraq and when we went into Afghanistan in response to a terrorist group. Remember, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is why we went into these two places, and they don't get an indict on a Robert Page study. But next, let's talk about complacency. Now recognize they don't show the long-term impacts of military intervention. They say like there's going to be like the vacuum effect, right? We give you the warrants behind that these other countries have explicitly said they're not going to commit ground combat troops because the United States is the leader. Recognize that they're not going to be garnering their impacts at the end of their second contention because they don't have the internal link. And again, they don't even impact why the vacuum effect is going to be the biggest impact in the round. Look to the fact that they don't have long-term stability because the special operations only work 6% of the time for their political objectives and less than 50% of the time for their military objectives. They don't have solvency in the long term. You have to default for the neg on anti-American.
So I believe we have 132 left.
122.
32. Oh, you do have 22?
We'll go with 22 then.
Okay, we'll just go with 22.
Yeah, I have 22 as well, so
Oh, I must have missed
122.
Opponents ready? Oliver. And of course the military. Let's start on framework. We agree that long-term stability is important, but throughout this entire round, they've ignored the caveat we put on that weighing analysis, which is that you have to look to global long-term stability and not just the short-term stability in this one region that they talk about. Remember the weighing analysis I do in rebuttal, Oliver sends in summary, and that I'm doing right now, that the impacts coming out of our second contention on multilateralism impact the globe. Having more deterrence to conflicts abroad, having a stronger military to fight conflicts, and having less anti-American sentiment across the entire world are going to outweigh whatever's happening in this one country. That being said, let's move to the first main vote issue, which is going to be multilateralism. The first is the vacuum effect. Remember the clean warrant here that we're extending. The entire idea that we are drawing in allies who want to curry favor with the United States. These aren't even like regional allies in the Middle East. These are external countries who are going to be joining in because they want to curry favor with us. The second warrant is political capital, and we tell you that the Middle East nations have a unique incentive to do this. They just respond by saying that they've explicitly said that they won't, but they only read Jordan and Turkey. Meanwhile, we tell you that Jordan and Saudi Arabia have explicitly said that they will, and Kagan tells you that our regional allies holistically will do it because they just want us to take a lead. But that means that even if you buy that that's warrant is a wash, we still extend the third warrant, which is that we break cycles of tension. When the problem in the Middle East is that nobody's willing to take the lead because they will bear the brunt if they go in alone. That's why Ethioni says that when one person starts, the West follow. That means we're causing multilateralism. The impacts of that are going to single-handedly win us the round. First of all, Sandler, who tells you that our allies get stronger. That improves our national security and military capability. Second of all, Metz, who tells you that we actually deter conflicts around the globe. Oliver tells you that that's the biggest impact on scope. And third of all, Peters, who tells you that even if the U.S. is leading the operation, the fact that we're working with other countries decreases anti-American sentiment abroad. Even if they win that they decrease terrorism just in Iraq, we decrease it abroad, that's going to be a bigger impact on scope. Now on to ISIS specifically. We have conflicting warrants. They have Oxford saying they'll get mad at us after we intervene, and we have Byman saying that ISIS is really, really bad. Prefer Byman, he's ISIS specific, and in Clinic Sen Choi, their paper evidence just talks about, doesn't isolate for anti-terror interventions. Choi is the only study in this entire round that only looks to anti-terror interventions and finds that they are successful in ending terrorism. Thank you.